Hello, welcome to today's meeting recap. I'm sorry that we had a meeting with Jesse and Akshara and it went 2 hours and it was great, but unfortunately there was a technical glitch. So I'm here, I'm going to recap the meeting and hopefully we get everything that we talked about. I like the spontaneity of the longer meetings, but this is probably just as good. So this is our website, our main website, for those of you who haven't seen it in a while. This has all of our publications and our engagement links and our people and collaborations. So we have current alumni and members, Jesse, who's our lab manager, myself, and then our collaborators in different groups and labs. And this is our medium. This is our outreach pedagogy. This is education, big and unfinished ideas, and so forth. So there's a lot of good stuff here. And if you want to get a recap of things, where we are, that's a good place to start. We also have this stream here where we have the latest Saturday morning NeuroSim meeting recording. In this case, it'll be a recap. And then we have our Medium and our Twitter feed, which is actually pretty active. So check that out. So if you want to recap our Saturday morning NeuroSim meetings, you can go to this widget here, or you can go to this list, which actually has more our readings and our materials in more detail. So if you go to this Saturday morning NeuroSim in our ORL group GitHub organization, you'll see that we have this list of Saturday morning NeuroSim meetings. It's an archive going back to 2020, August of 2020. If you go to last week's meeting, you'll see that there were meeting notes, and the meeting notes have YouTube links, Twitter thread links, and some special readings. In this case, it was Cybernetics and Development by Michael J. Apter, which we reviewed in the meeting. So check that out, and I'll be putting these archives in place. And so this is helpful when we want to go back to a earlier meeting. We want to do some meeting archaeology here and go back to October 10th. What were we doing in October 10th? We were talking about submitting to NeuroMatch 3. We were also doing some other papers which are in this Twitter thread, and other things. It's easy to lose track, and we've talked about this in past meetings. It's easy to lose sight of where we were just 3 months ago. It almost feels like 3 years. There's this time dilation when we talk about so many things, and so it's important to have this be grounded in this sort of archive. So I want to do a Slack review first, and when we were in the meeting, Jesse and I were doing the Slack review, and Akshara showed up, and we talked more about what was in the Slack. So it's important to go over the Slack, I think, once a week to get a sense of where we are. So the first thing is the Brain Organoids channel. If you're not in our group, in our group Slack, if you're watching just on YouTube, contact me via email, or go to our website and contact me or Jesse. We can invite you into the Slack. It's a launch pass invite, and so you can join in our more private conversations that are more spontaneous and go on throughout the week. So we get people in our lab who are posting things. Katerina Wojciuk, who's not really in the lab per se, but she's an associate. She's at UC Santa Cruz, and she works on Organoids. And so she posted a paper on understanding the human brain using brain organoids as a structure function theory. That's something that I found another paper on neuroorganoids, a brand new paper again. An early cell-shaped transition drives evolutionary expansion in the human forebrain. And this is by Madeline Lancaster's group. And so these are both very interesting papers. We've talked about neuroorganoids in the past. We've talked about how they're basically, we get like a small group of stem cells that we can guide their differentiation in neurons or other types of differentiated cells, and we can build these little structures we call organoids. And in the DevaWorm group, we've talked about not only organoids, but blastoids and other developmental cell aggregations. And so you can study a lot of things with organoids. You can study all sorts of things about the human brain. You can use neural organoids. You can look at the expansion of the human forebrain using neural organoids. You can look at the maturation of cortical organoids, looking at what happens postnatally. You can even do things like knock in a Neanderthal gene, and you can study Neanderthal brains, as they call it. Now, it's a rough analog, and it's similar to what we do in computational modeling, which is we abstract the system, we build a model of it, and then we test our hypotheses. So in that way, it's model building, but just in a biological context. And so this is a paper from Morgan, who posted this on brain cell clusters grown in a lab for more than a year, mirror changes in a newborn's brain. So we have this developmental AI initiative going on, but we also have this brain organoids initiative going on. And I'd like to ramp this up in the next couple weeks and months, because I think it's very useful. We don't have wet lab facilities in our lab per se, but we do have access to secondary data sets. So we'll be trying to do this over the next several months. And, even perhaps integrating it into the neuro AI, or to the developmental AI roadmap. So, because this week we attended the Embodied Intelligence workshop, and we'll talk about that in a minute, we also we sort of revisited Bradenburg vehicles, especially the developmental Bradenburg vehicles. And so we had a couple things going on there. We had this preprint a couple weeks ago on embodied continual learning. We finally put it out on the archive. This is the long-suffering baby minds paper that got rejected from the baby minds workshop because it wasn't really like a baby. It was a generalized developmental model. But we got to present on this at the EI workshop. And Rishab has expressed interest in this. As you can see, he's wanting to do some more synthesis and get more deeply involved in things. And I welcome that. I have a paper that he sent to me earlier this week that I will review in a little bit. Call for involvement. Keep checking this channel. There isn't much going on this week, but we'll be putting things in here. Cognition Futures was also active this week. We talked a lot about things that happened at this Embodied Intelligence workshop. We also have a couple papers that I put in here. One was, Why Did Mimetics Fail? This is a paper that I found and I was reading, and I sent this mainly for Jesse, but for other people as well. The idea behind this paper is that you had this two fields emerge sort of at the same time, and they had focused on the study of culture. So one was this idea of mimetics, which is the sort of, these encapsulated pieces of information called memes. And Richard Dawkins made memes popular, and he popularized memes and wrote about it in some of his books. But ultimately, it was a failure as a research program. Mimetics kind of plodded along, and then the Journal of Mimetics was suspended in activity due to lack of quality submissions. This went on for about maybe 15 years, and they finally pulled the plug on the publication. So you see memes more now in the context of the internet, like internet memes, Twitter memes, and things like that. But what another field that sort of was founded at about the same time was cultural evolution, and their interest in integrating ideas, and they didn't call them memes, but they were, cultural units with population genetics. And so this is more focused on the cultural evolution of ideas. And so this actually was more successful. And in fact, it's expanded its reach in recent years, and it's continuing to expand with different players in the field. And so this is a good example of what we were talking about last week, where we have a common ancestor. And then we have these two things that branch away from the common ancestor, and they have this sort of differential survival. In one case, there's a lot of there's very strong survival and proliferation. On the other hand, we have this thing that dies off and goes extinct. So it's a very phylogenetic view of these cognition trajectories that Jesse talks about. Another thing that we had here was this Augmented Intelligence Map. And so we don't talk too much about augmented intelligence so much in the group, but I'll talk about that in a little bit here. But we have this map, and it's based on the Monoscope is a humanities website, and so they've created this map called the Funnel of I, and it has to do with machine intelligence, augmented intelligence, and collective intelligence. And this is a political axis here and a technological axis. And they cover all sorts of different topics, like from Gibson, not J.J. Gibson, but the science fiction author. Clark and Chalmers, The Extended Mind. They talk about Berners-Lee, Google Brain, Apple, Ashby, Engelbart, and all these like major players. And they kind of put these in a space. So what I like about this especially is this technological axis. It's not a quantitative axis, but it's a sort of an ordinal axis with concepts instead of numbers. And these concepts are epistemic stages. So you have like sign, information, algorithm, and intelligence. And this is, I think this is a good way to as a counter to like a typical bivariate graph, where you have one thing against another thing. So in this case, it would be technology versus politics, and then trying to put numbers on those graphs, on those axes, and trying to approximate the number. In this case, it's a concept, and it kind of really gets into this idea of, and we talk about this in AI ethics too, this idea of sort of the epistemology of what you're measuring. So you're measuring something, what does it mean? Or how do you arrive at those numbers? And it's a very good way to think about that. So that's something interesting. Another thing that I pointed out was this was the last slide in my EI workshop presentation. So this is this going back to this intelligence augmentation idea. So this is a sort of an a mechanoid or some sort of model. They used to build these in the Enlightenment and in the latter part of the Middle Ages, where they would build these mechanoids or whatever they are, and they would simulate humans, but it was a mechanical system. And so this was something that was very popular with Da Vinci and people like that. So this is one example of intelligence augmentation, or behaving like a human, but it's a machine. It's a model of a human. The after picture here is a little bit different. This was the 1570s. This is 1958. This is Ashby. This is the design for an intelligence amplifier. And this is a proposal he wrote in 1958. And it basically spells out this very small first-order closed-loop feedback system, where the idea is that you have X, which is the user, or maybe the brain is a better way to put it. And so the entire brain is boiled down to this variable X. And G is a notion of intelligence, and people have measured intelligence, and G is supposed to be a general measure of intelligence. So, take that for what it's worth. You're taking brain and the intelligence and you're reducing it to a single variable. Then S is the amplifier. So S is this thing in the environment that amplifies G. And then U is the feedback. So this helps X adapt to S or adapt to its environment via S, and it increases G, which is the implication here. It's positive feedback. So you can think of X as a human brain tuned to a computer. S is the computer that is doing something. The X is putting stuff into the computer S. They're taking their intelligence and they're putting it into the computer. And then the computer is doing some process. And then U is the feedback. It improves performance for X. So, you might put your submissions into a spreadsheet and then be able to save it. And that augments your memory or G, which is, again, it's a very general measure. You could just assume, say, memory. And then it would improve the performance of X. So it's an interesting paradigm, and I think we'll want to revisit this in coming weeks. I know Andy Clark had a talk at EI Workshop on a little bit of intelligence augmentation. I actually met him many years ago. We had dinner with him, and we talked about intelligence augmentation. And he has an interesting take. He's a philosopher, so he doesn't really deal with the heavy-duty computational side of it. But leave that for now. And then there's these things that Jesse put in the channel. Tom Froese, who's an activist, on the role of AI and the ongoing paradigm shift within the cognitive sciences. And this is something that we talked about this in the meeting, and we talked about how there's this paper was written in 2007. And around 2010, 2011, we started to have the beginnings of the deep learning revolution and the machine learning revolution. So there's all this like heavy data-driven AI that's about to hit the world. And this was right before that. So they're interested in GoFi and like, what comes after GoFi. And so the language is quite different. But and this is something that we talked about in terms of cognitive futures. What happens when you have, say, for example, a field where you talk about certain things and you have a theoretical framework, and then there's a huge dosh of data-driven work that comes into the field. It could be like the invention of a new technology or some sort of other thing that happens like machine learning. You get a renewed interest, maybe you get a lot of data generated, then you have to recalibrate your ideas. But in doing so, you usually end up with these data-driven periods where people create their own languages. So these languages then evolve in parallel. So, machine learning and deep learning have their own specialized languages. They use their own algorithms. They have their own approach to the world, which actually grew out of cognitive science. But it's a totally different track. And so the challenge is to bring these back together. So the other thing about this paper that's interesting is that Rodney Brooks wrote a paper in 1997. He was talking about some missing principle, and he came up with this idea of juice. And so I missed it in the workshop, but apparently there was this big conversation about Brooks' juice. So what is juice? And Jesse asked me what juice is, and I said, well, it's like the classic comic strip where they show like a theory being made, and then there's one variable that stands for, then a miracle happens. Well, that's juice. And I think that's maybe a good critique of the idea. I think it's just a placeholder for something we don't know. But I think, I don't know how productive that is. In as much as it's always productive to say like it's dark matter, or it's juice, or it's magic. I don't know. But, that's where we were in 97. And we're coming up with all sorts of insights about, machine learning and deep learning. And we're also coming up with insights about, regular cognition as well. And so this all needs to be integrated. And, it's fascinating just to study the trajectory. But and then he had, Jesse also pointed this Adam Safran talk from the workshop. This body is a prototypical object and causal system. So it was a focus on infant development and how action perception loops are sort of, that's like a lot of what is generated in development is this perception action loop and the formation of it. And I think actually one of the papers that I recently published in Frontiers, I talk about this in the context of C. elegans, where you have this connectome that emerges in development, and then it gets wired up and it starts to behave. So how does that process start? There's like at some point where the perception action loop starts to kick in, right? Like, so what is it? There's a lot of physiology that goes on before that, but how does it actually start to integrate in development? And that's a good way to look at it, because we have to do this every time someone's born and they grow into an adult. They have to go through this. So we can revisit this later. Conference materials, there's some information on the New York Conference of Women in Computing. So thank you, Jesse, for organizing this. He presented on some of the latest materials on that. There's a group paper that's being produced, and it's not going to be published as is, but it's an organizational document. Min Tran. Thank you, Min Tran, for contributing to that. I think Daniela may also have contributed recently to it. I know Daniela was at the workshop as well. She didn't present, but she was in there, and she was contributing. So thank you for your contributions there. And so that's good. Cybernetics, we have nothing really new there. The Developmental AI channel, there are two papers I posted. One is on unlimited associative learning, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then Living Things Are Not Machines, or 20th Century Machines, which is another paper that Jesse really liked. This is something we're probably going to include in the allostasis machines paper when we rewrite it. So, and I'm going to be in touch with Danielle, and we're going to work on the final version of that. So we have some other things here that were posted. This paper on a neurocomputational model of post-traumatic stress disorder. We have this, we'll talk about the epistemological directories in a minute, but there's the preprint link for the preprint that we're producing. So I'm trying to think of other things. The Ethics, Tech, and Society has a lot of stuff that's been posted recently. Jesse did an AI ethics framework update a couple days ago, so that's on his YouTube channel. He's fleshing out the presentation script. So this is the doc that he made for ethics. This is the ethical frameworks document. So this goes through like the script that they're going to use for the presentation. He's also collecting things. So here's Min. There are a number of topics. He's been talking about AI ethics, comparative analysis, AI bias, feedback and algorithmic auditing. So this is Krishna. Differentiating AI safety and AI ethics. What's going on at Google. So that's a politics sort of thing. Also, that Google is a large corporation and they don't like to have their meal ticket challenged. But I think actually, you can go back to the critiques that physicists used to make of the military-industrial complex. That's very similar to this. Like what happened was the military-industrial complex consisted of a bunch of different defense contractors. And the physicists, as I mentioned in the last meeting, were very involved in building the atomic bomb, and they were involved in the national labs, which were sort of run by the Department of Energy, but also the DoD was involved in them. And so the agenda was always like defense. But at the same time, that means that if you're a dissident in some way, if you don't agree with what the government's doing, then you don't really have a voice. And so that was one of the critiques of that model, was that, I can't, as a physicist, because I'm an independent thinker, I can't critique what my government's doing or what the defense contractors are doing. Okay, so that's very similar to what's going on in Google, actually. Moral theory, computational modeling of ethics, and then a conclusion. As I said, Jesse said that this isn't going to be published as is. It's going to be like maybe some parts will be published as papers. Some of this will be used as a script. So this is going to be an interesting development, and we'll see how that how we can run through that in the next couple months. So he's put a couple other readings in here. I want to get to the events discussion. So Jesse created a shared Google Doc like we do for every workshop and conference. We have this. This is the shared doc. So the shared doc is very long, but if you're interested in participating in it, and that means like if you go back and you watch the videos at the websites, if you go to eiworkshop.org, you click on it, you can go and you can actually view some of the talks post workshop, and then you can put your reflections in here. He's got it organized by days, so day 1, day 2, and morning and afternoon sessions. This was a European-based workshop, so Jesse and I, being in North America, only caught the afternoon sessions live. We're going to have to go back and look at the recordings. But I would recommend everyone look through here. This is great stuff. Beyond Sheep Control, the sensory motor loop. I mean, there's just all sorts of really good stuff in here, and you really need to get into it and think about it to get the full effect of it. So it's great. And this is 49 pages long, so it's a Word doc that has just an amazing amount of reflection in it. We need to mine this, like I've talked about in previous meetings. We need to mine this, but it definitely contribute to it if you have insights. Events news. Then there's this stuff about. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Free energy principle. I think I put a couple of insights in there. A couple of papers. There's some free energy principle stuff. I know that Carl Friston was at the workshop, and he talked about free energy principle in the context of embodiment. So you'll probably want to check that recording out. What else do we have in this channel? I think there are not too much left. I think there's the office hours open chat. We have some things in here that Jesse put. Oh, this Simon raised a question about second order cybernetics versus embodied intelligence. This is Simon McGregor, and he was at the workshop. He talked about the role of the observer. And of course, we talked about this in the Philosophy Web Cafe talk that I gave in, I think it was December. And it's a very interesting topic. We need, we talk a lot about the observer in agent-based modeling. We talk about the observer in biology, developmental biology. So, I think we should push that angle a little bit more aggressively. It's definitely somewhere where people are thinking about it. There's also this issue about, and Jesse did he did another recording, I think the next day, on like a recap of the EI workshop. It was a whole hour. So good for Jesse. And this recaps his views on the EI workshop. He walks through some of the stuff, some of his reflections. This is kind of, pulling stuff out of the shared doc. And I think it's useful to go through this even, because this is actually more condensed than the document isn't that condensed, but you know what I mean. There's some notable nuggets about we talk about developmental freedom, and in the embodied continual learning paper, we talk about developmental freedom. And there were people at the conference, I think it was, I can't remember who it was. It was, Daniel Polanyi, who talked about empowerment. And so he talked about empowerment in development, or in embodied cognition. And I thought about this and I think, obviously Jesse thought about it as well. There are very strong connections to this concept of developmental freedom, where you have this crystallization and rigidity of things versus the ability to explore cognitively. And so I think those things can be linked. And I think I don't know if he's published anything on empowerment, but we'll see. So there's a lot to follow up on from the workshop. He apparently had technical difficulties with this recording as well. I don't know if it's the weather, or if it's juice of some type or what, but and then he also talks about this session 2 afternoon panel. So this is all good stuff to explore. There isn't really much else this week. I know that's a lot for 1 week. And I think that if you're interested in any of this, please follow up on it. Just join the conversation, the channels, or put your own insights down. I encourage it. So, that's all we have for the Slack and the open notes. And we have our New York Women in Computing Conference document here, and he's working on a slideshow as well, so that's going to be something to communicate with him on. I also wanted to bring up something. There are a couple things I'd like to revisit in the near future. So I want to talk about, first of all, we have this critical periods in development Discord, and this is different from the Slack. This is a different platform. This is Discord. It's a server in Discord that you can join. We have Akshara, we have Krishna Katyal, we have Rishab, we have Jesse, and Kazia Kazdan and Jason Yoder are people I met at Artificial Life 2020 in the workshop that we were presenting at, and they wanted to talk about this topic, and we started this Discord, but it kind of died out. There are a couple channels on the server. We have a bibliography channel for papers. I found something on the development of spatial cognition that might be really interesting to Stefan and Jesse and myself. I know Stefan talked about his developmental Bradenburg vehicles, and he has the spatial cognition example. This would be a great paper to follow up on with. The general channel, which is for just general things, resources from outside, I found some talks on brain evolution and postnatal development by Robert Barton. He's a evolutionary anthropologist at Durham University. So tangential discussions, which I'll talk about this physical intelligence talk later. Current debates in life history research. So there are things we can talk about that aren't really in the main scope. And then developmental AI, which is explicitly for developmental AI. I need to put the roadmap up here. I haven't done that yet. The most recent version. So I would like to make this more active. So if you're interested in critical periods or even just in development and its applications to AI, please join this Discord server. And you can email me for the link. I can get you in. The other thing I'd like to update on is this Zotero account. So we have a Zotero library for all of our different sub-projects. We have DevoWorm, we have embodiment, educational resources, epistemological directories, and all these things are we're trying to add to them as we can. So if you're interested in contributing papers or you're interested in joining in and creating your own libraries, let us know. I haven't logged in here, but you log in, you join ORL, and Jesse can help you with that process. And we have our libraries all set. So if you want to get a deep dive into the literature, there's your chance. So now I want to talk about our submissions, our papers and conferences that we have coming up. So we talked about this list, and we had some discussion as to whether maybe this would be better served as a Notion file or a Notion page. Akshara asked about that. She said there are pros and cons to that. Jesse also has been doing some work with something called ZenHub, which visualizes the things that are due. So we have things that are accepted, and now we have things that are due from those. So those are on ZenHub, and I don't have the integration to show you right now, but Jesse did a demo in the Slack earlier, last week, so that's something to look forward to. We didn't do an update on it this week. So let's go through some of these things. The allostasis machines. This is accepted to the Emergent Interaction Workshop at SIGCHI. We need a 15-minute presentation, and we need to do a camera-ready version of the paper. And that's due by April 11th. So I told Daniela, who's our lab editor, that I will make the changes as recommended, and then I'll hand it off to her, and she'll confirm that the changes are adequate, and then we'll do the same with the presentation. And we'll get it recorded and sent by then. We have to record it on our own. So I may send out an invite if people want to join in and do a group recording. That would be great. I can set that up. Evolution 2021, you can submit to that until April 15th. There are a couple of submissions that we were talking about making. This is through DevoWorm, but if you're interested, it's there. Artificial Life 2021, we've submitted 2 papers and an extended abstract there. We're waiting on the reviews for those. CSV Conf version 6, which is coming up in May, we did not get accepted to that with our epistemological directories. And I think the reason is because they want to have fresh talks. We did one last year, so they want to have fresh talks, which is perfectly fine. They didn't seem very critical of it. They said they enjoyed it, but they didn't accept it. So we can actually recycle a lot of this stuff into either the epistemological directories manuscript, which I talked about when I was doing the Slack review. This is just something where we're compiling information about this research project, and maybe we'll release a white paper soon. Or I'm giving a talk to INCF next month, and maybe I'll put some more information about epistemological directories in that talk, and just to advertise it. There's a DevoLearn flash talk that was done, that's completed. NeuroMatch 4 is upcoming. We don't know when that is yet. The NeuroMatch Academy is getting ramped up, though, and that's something that we will keep an eye on. None of these are really relevant. This one is the Envision Conference. This is coming up on April 9th and 10th, so I'm working on an overview of the lab. I'm going to present it to the group, and it's something that's hosted at Princeton University, and it's sort of a futurist celebration of futurism, biology, tech, all these other areas, climate change, and the idea is to society. The idea is to get people together, give talks, and it's mostly student run at Princeton, but I like to get exposure to different groups, so hopefully maybe we can get some interesting conversations going, maybe some new collaborators. Let's see, next, the what's good? Gibsonian information is still under review. This Cultural Evolution Society, I was thinking of submitting like 2 things to this. One based on CGS models, which is a computational model of cultural evolution and cultural phenomenology, and then maybe something else. Maybe we could even submit something on cognition futures to this. And this is due April 30th. It's a pretty long-term thing. It's like it's a rolling deadline, and you can reserve time to do your own sort of presentation, and then there's another formal presentation. So I think if you get something in that's reasonable, I think they won't reject it, but we'll see. This is all virtual. Let's see. The Society and Ethics paper that's been accepted, and of course they're working on getting that done. That's April 9th and 10th as well. So that's going to be a busy weekend. We will be involved with both of those. The AI lexicon, so things that won't get put into the Society and Ethics presentation might be tossed off to the AI lexicon. Then I told Jesse that, maybe we can submit a session for SIPS 2021, which is a Society for Improvement in Psychological Science. It seems like that might be something. Oh, deadline's coming up. And then there's this application for an interest group. So this is through CogSci 2021. This is Cognition Futures. So we could actually either do Cognition Futures for Cultural Evolution or for CogSci. And, just do basically the same abstract and then see where it gets accepted. And then go from there. NeuroIPS, if you're interested in submitting to this, the abstract is May 19th. The full paper is due May 26th. And I was thinking maybe we submit some of our ethics work to this. There are a couple of ethics tracks in the main conference, and then later on, with a later deadline, there's some ethics workshops, and so that may be a good place too for the ethics stuff. We missed the Roman conference. We missed that deadline. We missed the IEEE conference deadline. This positive feedback in AI, that could be NeurIPS. That's C page 30 or C column 38. That's okay. Now I'm not sure if this is a row or column. I'm always embarrassed that I always get those confused, but so there are four workshops that I have, or conferences and workshops that I have listed here. And these came from the last week in talking with people at the EI workshop. The first is this Living Machines conference, and this was Paul from one of our sessions, and he's involved in this conference committee, and he said, this might be a good place to submit. The deadline for the 2020 version is May 1st. The 2021 website isn't quite up yet. Full papers, 8 to 12 pages. You can do an abstract of 4 pages. 3 pages or 3 self-citations are allowed maximum. Now, this is an area where people tend to go overboard with self-citations, so I've never seen that before, but it's probably a good idea to have that enforced. And I'm not saying that, because I do that too. I mean, I'm not like... then there's Dynamic Walking, which is a good conference for like robotics and embodied cognition and, biomechanics. And it just kind of combines all those. And this year it's going to be different. They're going to have there's a deadline of April 20 for the abstract. And then every month, like May, June, and July, there are going to be different parts of the conference. So I think in May is like the biomechanics part. In June, there's like the embodied robotics part. And then in July, there's like the I guess, just hardcore robotics part. I'm not really sure what the tracks are, but they're distributed over 3 months. So this will be an interesting thing. Akshar actually, she just kind of expressed interest in doing something with developmental Bradenburg vehicles, but I'm not really sure what we can do. I did it. Actually, I did Dynamic Walking many years ago, and it was walking robots, mainly, at that time, and I submitted something on reaching and grasping with arms, and so it was a little bit out of place, but I could see, like, dynamic wheeling maybe is a way to... This is not something I want to open right now. Okay, just a minute. So this is something that, it probably get accepted. We just have to write it a little bit more relevant. But it's interesting. I think they'd probably like that work. The other two one is this open-ended evolution workshop, which is associated with A-Life 2021. The deadline for that is May 30, and this is the website. Open-ended evolution is where in cognition we always assume that there's a goal. There's goal-directed behavior, etc. In evolution, you can't assume there's a goal. People will implement evolutionary algorithms which seek out a goal, right? And then there are, which aren't really how way natural evolution works. Natural evolution works by just kind of exploiting niches and expanding in ways, So a lot of the open-ended evolution stuff focuses on creativity or innovation, technological innovation, and the like. And so we might actually do something with respect to reinforcement learning. I pointed this out to Rashab, and he seemed pretty interested. So we'll see how that goes. Lifelike computing systems, that's sort of similar to this Living Machines conference, but it's hosted by A-Life 2021. So, this is something, this is May 24th deadline. So this is something where we can maybe somewhat double dip here between Living Machines and lifelike computing. We can put in something slightly different for both and see what gets accepted, what people like, and the like. So these are all options. So these are our submissions for this week, and I recommend that you go to this spreadsheet, ask for permissions. I have it in the Slack. We might put this up on Notion or something as well. Okay. So a couple points that I have in my notes here. I'm going to go through my notes a little bit. I talked about the juice. I talked about, it's another theme at this workshop was that in the enactivist camp, you have sort of this view of development as emergence, as an organizing principle. So emergence is sort of like the juice because, emergence is at least, it's a process that we somewhat understand. It's not a stand-in for magic, but it also isn't very poorly understood. And so, we're having this, we're in this situation where we're trying to find a good term for understanding this stuff. And, the terminology is still a little bit unclear, but the enactivists suggest that development and emergence, development is emergence, and then that's how we can understand the juice. Jesse also revisited this idea of technological mastery. And in doing so, we talked about two themes, anti-homeostasis and things that are what he called held together in action. And this is something that goes back to, I think, Norbert Wiener. So held together in action is sort of like emergence in the sense that things are regulated. There's this idea of a regulatory milieu. They're all this, and that's something that they talk about homeostasis. So those two things, this internal milieu, and then anti-homeostasis being the dysregulation of that milieu, and then held together in action. Those two things are, I think, key to this juice idea. And then there's, of course, disruptions of flows to information, which is also anti-homeostatic, and also is, so we're kind of poking this bag with sticks, and we're saying, well, look, we know that we don't know what's in it, but we know kind of what, happens when you violate it, or when you, we kind of know that there are a bunch of parts and they're held together. We don't know how, but that's important for stability. And so these are a lot of things we should think about more. In the ethics stuff, and we go back to that chart I showed you of the variables. Jesse mentioned Abiba Berhani's paper in Patterns on AI ethics, and that's actually, it has an interesting tie into this idea of creating variables and creating conceptual variables versus quantitative variables. And even if you have a quantitative variable, what does it mean? What does the measurement consist of? These are, in an experimental setting, they call it internal validity. So, like, what are your variables measuring what you think they're measuring? So that's a very important point. And let's see what else we have in the notes. I don't think there is too much else directly on the things we've covered already. Now I'd like to get into the papers. And so there are a couple things in the papers. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was this idea of physical intelligence. And Metin City, who was one of the presenters at the workshop, he came up with this idea, or he presented on this idea of physical intelligence. So physical intelligence is a new paradigm. Okay, so he's from Max Planck Institute. He's an engineer. He does a lot of good stuff. He presented on a lot of this. So methods to create physical intelligence, a lot of the self-organization, self-replicating juice type stuff. And he's doing this with mechanical systems, with biological systems, with propulsive systems at the microscale. So you can see the scale bar there. He's doing a lot of good work, but it's like he's trying to synthesize it. And that's where, this idea of functional or of physical intelligence comes in. So this is the perception-action loop. And he's arguing that you see this in cells, like in this amoeba. You see this in other systems like materials. You see this in different... You see this in organisms with no nervous system, no neurons. You see this in C. elegans with 302 neurons. You see this in jellyfish with 6,000 neurons, and then humans with 86 billion neurons. So there's similar behaviors across all these scales and sizes of nervous system. And so it's a very interesting idea. Here's the body and environment and all the things. He's kind of cataloged everything here. He even says that you can see this in things like strand beasts. And so this is like I talked about the automaton before, this is a kinetic sculpture. So this kinetic sculpture, it's supposed to be a video. This guy, Theo Jansen, he's in the Netherlands, and he builds these kinetic sculptures. And they're just like a bunch of sticks and mechanisms. And he gets them to run down the beach. He has video of them running down the beach. They're like crawling along the beach. Like you might see a large insect, if there were an insect that big, would crawl down the sand. The thing is that these things can crawl, but of course they can't think and react. So they could, maybe step over a rock if it's in the way, if it's not too big. It won't, purposefully avoid the rock, however. And that's sort of the idea, So we're talking about physical intelligence. Are we talking about, something that's like a memory system, or are we just talking about intelligent-looking behavior? There's a lot of stuff that's still sort of outstanding, and so I think that's a good place to go to the other thing that I was going to tell you about, which was that I gave I've been working on this idea independently for a long time, actually. It hasn't been on the front burner. So this is a physical intelligence augmentation section of one of our websites, Representational Brains and Phenotypes website. If you go there, you'll see this stub, and there's a lot of work that's fairly old. I gave a talk. This is a talk I gave in 2007 to a lab group in the computer science department where I did my PhD, and they were interested in evolutionary computation and things like that. So it was a little bit outside of what they were doing, but they were really interested in it. So these are really dated. These slides, Jeff Hawkins' old book is here, but it kind of gets into this idea of prediction and models, and basically you're bridging like robots, animals, and even like phenotypes and other types of biological systems. There's this idea that I didn't, of course, at this time I hadn't heard of a lot of things, but and I'd like to revisit this talk, do a second version and maybe a paper on this, but didn't know about something called non-neuronal cognition, which of course we talk about in our other group a lot. And I think Akshara pointed out that, yes, we talked about this. She recognized the non-neuronal cognition aspect. We've done some work. We did a presentation at Neuromatch on basilaria on the diatoms. And so this is not in this part, but the principles are pretty broad, and I think we can fit that into there. So we have this just some of these principles that aren't necessarily tightly worked out, but I mean, it's basically combining muscle and motor control and phenotypes, and even things, like you have, I talk about down here, I talk about scaling laws, and I talk about sensory behavior, and then I talk about molecular systems, which these are actually cell cultures. These are neural, microelectrode arrays where you have a bunch of neurons growing in addition. It controls a virtual environment. So that, in that case, you have a sort of even more nascent nervous system than some of the small nervous systems. But you also have molecular systems, molecular pathways, which exhibit intelligent behaviors or maybe adaptive behaviors that don't require any sort of brain at all, not even a cell. They're just molecules. And so you have these things that, maybe we're kind of reaching here, but, I think definitely there's a lot to learn here and a lot to put together. So, yeah, I just kind of threw things at a wall with some of this, but there's definitely something here. I think we can actually incorporate a lot of this into the AI roadmap. So, yeah, I showed you this link. So that's the physical intelligence part. And I think, that's we should talk about that more in the coming weeks and months. And definitely incorporate into the AI roadmap, which is always being updated. So remember that. So I'm going to talk about a couple. I wanted to give Jesse some pointers. I talked about this with him already, but for those of you who weren't at the meeting, I saw his Cog Futures presentation at the workshop, and it's very good. He hasn't really done a lot of hardcore work on it, so there's that, but I wanted to give him some suggestions for future development. So one of these things is we need to hit the review articles more review articles, hit them more critically, assemble a bibliography of articles where they compare, like the one I talked about in the channel, where they're doing this comparison of mimetics and cultural evolution, for example. And then assemble a bibliography of these things and annotate it. So we've talked about doing annotated bibliographies. And finally, a historiography, which is where you put things in a logical, historical order and then trace their connections. And so then we can actually draw out these trajectories on a Miro board. And so Paul from the AI workshop did this with his work. It was like a 30-year retrospective. And he drew it out on a Miro board, and he was scrolling through it in the talk. And it was really good, really effective. So the second thing, or the third thing we want to do then is create hypotheses for maybe what happened. So one example of this is cybernetics. We talked about this, I think, last week or the week before, where cybernetics is actually maybe like a common ancestor for electrical engineering and neuroscience. When you're talking about systems, cybernetics is that common language. But then, of course, the fields diverged. And so neuroscience is doing its own thing. Electrical engineering is doing its own thing. And then with the machine learning revolution and with AI more generally, you get these crossover events. And the crossover events are awkward because the languages diverged. And so when you have a common ancestor in cybernetics, you have different terms in different fields, and it gets specified in different ways. And then when they come back together, it's very confusing. It needs to be worked out all over again. So that's one example of a trajectory. And we can actually use that as an example. Like we say, hypothesis, this is what happened. Then this is what it should look like in practice. Maybe this is how we can overcome this obstacle to communication, to understanding. So there's a lot of potential there. And in one specific instance, we can actually go back and ask what happened to CogSci, but address this in three ways. The first is this linguistic or semantic change due to new technologies or the emergence of subfields. And the instance I gave earlier in the meeting with respect to you had CogSci and you had this development of sort of a language, and then you had the machine learning and deep learning revolution, which introduced a whole new bunch of stuff. It's largely data-driven, but you also had neuroimaging data coming in, which was also very data-driven. And so all those things are, informing cog-sci, but there's no common language yet. And so this is one of the things that happen in cog-sci, perhaps. Another are epistemic shifts. So these are shifts that don't involve data-driven things. They involve new theories and ideas. And last week we talked about paradigm shifts and avalanches, or metaphoric avalanches. So it's like, statistical signatures of avalanches, phase transitions. We talked about that. And we talked about that in the context of paradigm shifts. And so this is another thing that's similar to this example from the deep learning revolution, although it's epistemic in nature. It's the knowledge that's changing, not the data available. The third one is this functional change. So you could have a paradigm shift, which is not necessarily the same thing as this epistemic shift, just simply like a paradigm shift in the field. And then debates such as like the difference between like two rival approaches. So we talked in an earlier meeting about Bayesian methods versus cybernetics. You have these rival approaches that often one comes out on top. And so that can affect the trajectory. Sometimes they come together in sort of a dialectical fashion. So there's that to consider as well. And this is a note for Jesse about this. This all originated from a Sam Gershman tweet from March 13th. At least this first part about the languages changing. So yeah, there's a lot to develop here, and I think we have some momentum on this cog future stuff. So people are welcome to contribute to that, by the way, if you want to. Finally, I'm going to cover two papers, and I'm going to cover them quickly in the recap here. The first we talked about was Unlimited Associative Learning in the Origins of Consciousness. So this is a newer paper in biology and philosophy, and it involves Eva Jablonka, who's a person who does a lot of evolutionary biology, epigenetics stuff. Also Simona Ginsberg and Jonathan Birch, and this is a European-Israeli group. They different universities, and they're doing this work on Ginsberg and Jablonka, the last two authors, have developed a novel approach to studying the evolutionary origins of consciousness, the Unlimited Associative Learning Framework. The central idea is there is a distinctive type of learning that can serve as a transition marker for the evolutionary transition from non-conscious to conscious life. And so one way to understand this is to know that there are these things in... first of all, the difference here is between systems that are complex and behave, like cyclones, stars, and volcanoes. So they behave, but they don't have like a consciousness. They don't have a, this goes back to physical intelligence. They're behaving, but it's not like intentional, and it's not conscious necessarily. So you have systems like that, but then you also have systems that have maybe some conscious experiences, like humans, or maybe like worms, or, probably not strand beasts. Strand beasts would be in this first category. Finding the line between the conscious and non-conscious behaviors and understanding how it's crossed is a major challenge. And this is a Godfrey Smith article. I don't know the exact citation, but you can look that up. So they've come up with this Unlimited Associative Learning Framework. And the basic idea of this, as I understand it, is that in life, and they go through this like defining life and non-life. So there's this sometimes futile exercise in doing that. But then you find out that like one of the conditions, the efficient conditions of life, is reproduction. So you can, if you have a cell, it can reproduce itself almost ad infinitum. There are limitations on the lifespan, but theoretically it's ad infinitum. Same thing with organisms, can reproduce ad infinitum. They can keep passing down their genetic material, and barring any sort of degeneration of the lineage, they can go on forever. And so the idea is that in organisms, in conscious systems, you have this associative learning that is both it's like a replicator, but it also can go on forever. There's no limit on this. So they go back to Maynard Smith and Zafmary, who were two of the people who proposed the idea of evolutionary transitions. And evolutionary transitions are periods of evolution where you go from like a single cell to a population of cells, a collective of cells. So you go from singular life to collective life. And the transition to consciousness is one such transition. That's what they're arguing. Again, it's a little bit controversial. They show that like unlimited heredity requires individuation, metabolism, stability, information storage, regulation of internal milieu, which we talked about, growth, reproduction, and death. So there are all these things that are maybe, you see in life, you see in like cognition, you see in physiology. That's what's required for unlimited heredity, which is what I talked about. If a cell divides, it should be able to divide until it, reaches some limit of viability or degenerates or something, but it theoretically can go on forever. Doesn't require any special juice for that to happen. But these things that are required for unlimited heredity also suffice for living systems. So the living system then is, these things are sufficient for a living system, but these things are also necessary for unlimited heredity. And I talked to Akshar and Jesse about the difference between sufficiency and necessity. And this is like a sort of a test of rigor that one uses to figure out if a hypothesis, if something is plausible or if something is implausible. So people use sufficiency and necessity all the time to evaluate evidence. Now, so there's this sort of idea between unlimited heredity and life versus non-life. So you have this issue here. So they talk about viruses. They talk about things that are sort of on the boundary of life and non-life. I'm trying to think if there's anything else in the paper I wanted to go over. Then they talk about unlimited associative learning itself. And so the central postulate of this is that it's the within lifetime analog of unlimited heredity. So in other words, now you have an organism that can reproduce, but within its life, it can make these associative learning or associations again and again and again. There's no limit on it. Now we know something about, I was talking about like regenerative medicine and regenerative organismal systems where you have these regenerating systems, like in flatworms, for example, is a model organism for regeneration. And what you can do with a flatworm is you can cut it into 4 parts, and it will regenerate 4 worms, full worms and everything. What's even more astounding about this is that you have 4 worms, but that they retain the memories of the original worm. So that's really interesting. Another interesting finding was in this, I think this week, there was a paper on aplasia, sea slugs. It's a common model organism in neuroscience. They actually found that if you took RNA from one sea slug and you put it into another sea slug, you can transfer a memory, effectively transferring some memory. And it's usually some, very basic associative behavior. But that's what we're talking about here. So there are a lot of things that control this associative learning. And maybe it's a biochemical cycle that allows for this as well, but we're not going to get into that now. But the idea is that you have these, we can be more precise about what UAL involves. It is associative learning with 5 crucial features. So you have compound stimuli. So this conditioned stimulus can be a compound of discriminable perceptual features. Novel stimuli, so you have conditioned stimuli that can be novel to the animal. Second order conditioning, so this is like goes back to behaviorism and operant conditioning, and other types of learning like that. And I think this is very interesting. We could probably do an experiment in terms of like reinforcement learning on some of these things. So then there's trace conditioning, which is where you have a time gap between the conditional and unconditional stimulus. And flexible, easily rewritable associations with value. So this is another thing that we can do. Part of the UAL framework is that these enhanced forms of associative learning form a natural cluster. So there's this idea of natural clusters being like the basis for like categorization, things like that. So you have unlimited associative learning. It requires these things, and it suffices for an experiencing system, which is then the basis for what they talk about when they talk about consciousness. One of these: agency and embodiment, registration of a self-other distinction, selective attention, binding, which is a thing in the brain, unification of stimuli, and integration over time. So there are a lot of things that we talk about in like machine learning and deep learning, and also in reinforcement learning, that are applicable here. So this is a good paper. The other paper I want to talk about is this replay paper, and this is something Rashad pointed me to. Replay in Minds and Machines. So this paper talks about experience-related brain activity patterns. And they talk about this in terms of like replaying stimuli. So this is something that we found in sleep. Often animals and humans will replay things in their sleep. And this is how they consolidate memories. They'll just replay the experience. And they'll keep doing it. When you practice something, you're essentially replaying it. If you practice the piano or practice a sport, you're replaying that procedural memory over and over. And you keep doing it, and you finally consolidate the memory as a procedural memory. So, in parallel, machine learning research has found that experience replay can lead to substantial performance improvements in artificial agents. So this can also be used in machine learning, and we usually think in machine learning in terms of training with a data set. You train a model, and then you can test it and get an accuracy. In this case, what they're saying is you can replay things that are procedural, not necessarily like episodic. Like most of your independently distributed data is episodic. It's something you observe, and then you memorize the object, and then you keep doing this, and you find a pattern. In this case, you're actually doing something procedural. You're taking a thing that happens in the world, you're playing the sequence, and you're just kind of encoding that sequence, and you do it over and over, and that's your training, but you're training on a different type of data, basically. So they provide an overview and findings of replay research from neuroscience and machine learning, and summarize the computational benefits an agent can gain from replaying that cannot be achieved through direct interactions with the world itself. So when we talk about embodiment, we talk about, say, our vehicles going out and experiencing light stimuli. There are certain ways in which the vehicles are wired that enable this light stimulus to be, encoded, but you also have to do it over and over again, and we think about that again in terms of training, but it's not like there's a difference between just training it on discrete information like objects or like letters or something, and then training it on like a scenario or a process or an experience, which goes back to the last paper. So that's I think those two papers kind of fit together in that way. We don't have I'm not really sure what we want to cover in this paper, just to say that there's a nice review of what goes on about replay, what we know in neuroscience, and then some of the things that have been done in machine learning. There's a lot that's been done in neuroscience on this. Like I said, this has been explored in sleep. So, that this is, I think people think this is a basis of memory, not at the molecular level necessarily, but definitely there's a electrophysiological response that you can measure for this. And so all of that is, I think, you can combine it with the other paper, or we can combine it maybe with some of these recent findings in aplasia, maybe in flatworms and in C. elegans, and even going into humans. I don't know if there's anything insightful to say about agent learning, but there are computational benefits of replay. So this is, we're talking about this in animals, but you have we can do the computational analysis, and we can actually find some really interesting things here. So the concept of replay actually differs between ML and neuroscience. I figured I'd point that out since we've been talking about language differences between fields. As described above, neuroscience emphasizes the sequential and often accelerated nature of replay, but often subsumes reactivation of memories as well as activation of internally generated neural sequences under the same term. ML methods, in contrast, often distinguish between experience replay, which corresponds to sampling from a memory buffer, and model-based methods, often referred to as planning. So robot planning, where they plan a path and they predict. So this is like just taking experience and replaying it. There's no goal-oriented nature to this. It's just, what did you experience? Let's replay it. That's the training, as opposed to like robot planning, which is more goal oriented and saying that there's a goal you need to reach. How do you reach it? Several new methods in ML focus on replaying sets of individual transitions, akin to only two adjacent place cells, which is a place cell is a thing in the hippocampus that encodes spatial memories. And so that's another thing we could talk about. I think the development of spatial cognition paper might be particularly insightful there, which do not have to form sequences spanning long trajectories through the environment. Okay. So this means that they don't have to do any planning necessarily. There is no goal directedness necessarily. It's just two representations of places, and then the question is, how does that path get traced? So, a place cell will encode like a place in space, and multiple place cells will give you different positions in space. How are those connected? And that's really what you need to know to have a replay of a replay experience. If I'm a mouse and I go through a maze to get a piece of cheese, what turns did I make and where did I make them? That's all I need to know. And then I can replay that, and it helps me figure out a mental model for this activity. So and then they talk about Sutton and Bartow. They talk about reinforcement learning. So our review is guided by the ML framework, which allows parallels to be drawn between reactivation of neural patterns and biological agents and replay of task states in artificial agents. So they hang this on reinforcement learning as a way to understand some of this. And they actually have this Botvinnik and Hesibis work in here. And I don't know, I think there's I guess it's not the papers I was thinking of. They did do some papers, those authors did do some papers on what we've cited before on like points of view. And so this is this agent thing where like you put agents in different points of view in different locations in a world, and you get the information, you train it at different locations, and it can synthesize a lot of the things that are going on in the world. And so this is actually a rule for agents, like agents can see things at different perspectives and put them together. I think I talked about this in the agent-based modeling paper, or the agent-based modeling presentation, where we talked about perspectives and different. We actually did a paper on that. We submitted it got rejected, but it's actually up on openreview.net, and we need to update that paper. But it's basically where you have different perspectives, and you have a population of agents, and they're sampling the world in different locations, and then they integrate that information. And one of the things that we wanted to make as an innovation to this was to take use it as a relativistic frame. So you would be looking at say a common geometric structure, which we called a viewpoint network. So we had these structures that were two-dimensional, but they look three-dimensional. They're isometrically rendered, and then these are viewpoint networks where the agents go around to different parts of the network, and they can view things at different angles, at different perspectives, and put together some pretty complex spatial information. This can also work with Mobius strips. I think in the talk I showed an example of Mobius strip where you have one view of a Mobius strip, like a head-on view, where your visual angle is pretty narrow, but you see that one view of the Mobius strip. And you can put those together. And actually, visual angle can vary, so we can actually get things in the periphery, things in the core of the visual system, etc. You can touch things, so you can have a haptic envelope. You can do all sorts of things, and that can all play into these different perspectives in different places in the environment that you can sample from. So that gives you a better idea of what's going on in your environment. So it's not just replay, actually. In that case, it's also just kind of getting more context, especially when you have a complex three-dimensional environment you want to explore. You get more information about it by using multiple agents, but also by using multiple points of view that are distinct. So they go through this, quite lengthy. We have... So they talk about, actually in this case, they talk about catastrophic interference. Humans and other animals do not necessarily seem to suffer from the computational problem of catastrophic interference, which means that they don't forget everything when they try to do another task. And so this is a problem with machines They often will do one task, train for one task, they can do that, but if they're asked to do another task or switch to that task, they forget. And of course, we talk about transfer and training, which is where you can transfer from one task to another, but machines aren't very good at that. I mean, we're working on it, or other people are working on it, but that's something that animals and humans do very effortlessly, but is very hard for machines to master. So machines can do temporal autocorrelation of experience, but they can't necessarily integrate all of this. So replay might be responsible for this. It's that juice that we don't have right now. So that's what they're suggesting. Reinventing the past. There's a lot of stuff, though, too, with like historical context here, right? Like, you could imagine an agent having a history and integrating their historical context and behaving according to that, or sharing it with other agents. And there are a lot of neat things you can do with replay and with getting into temporal stimuli and temporal, memories and things like that. It's a pretty open area. I think if we wanted to do something interesting here, I think it would be a perfect opportunity to do that. I think we built some of the framework for that. Other people have built other parts of that. And we can really maybe do something really kind of out there. Because we're not really a conventional machine learning group. We're not really a conventional AI group. We do all sorts of things. So I think we could bring something really interesting to the table. This is illustration of replay content. This is planning, where you're planning in a T-maze. The organism starts here, and they have to either go in this direction or this direction to get food. The T-maze, if you're acting with goal-directed behavior, you kind of know where it is, you're motivated, you go get it, right? You go get the cheese in this arm, you know it's in this arm because you've kind of predicted it, and you're really kind of keyed up to get that cheese, and so your goal is to go this way and get it. Learning, you can do like a retrospective evaluation. So instead of like kind of trying to find a pattern blindly, you might like think about like all your prior experiences and maybe figure out a principle for where the cheese goes. Is it random? Is it like always in this arm or in that arm when the sun's appearing in the sky? And now that would be something more like what a human would do, or maybe like an animal. In this case, it's just kind of like drawing from like random patterns, or if it's a stochastic appearance of cheese, you might just say, well, it's always in the right arm. Or sometimes organisms do this too, but it's not really the same thing. So there are a lot of they're trying to use a T-maze here to illustrate like planning, acting, learning. And planning being, this is actually planning, this is acting, so this is reacting. Planning would be planning out your path. So you'd have to plan out your path to the right or to the left. And if there's a lot of variation here, you might not make it because your planning algorithm would be disrupted. Acting, you just act on what you think is the answer. And then learning is where you're reflecting on this. So, okay, so this is a very long paper. A lot of nice references in here. And we'll have to go through these. Okay, so I think that's all for today. I wanted to just point out that we have a lot of opportunities to join the Slack. And thanks again to Jesse and Akshara for attending in person, and to Rashab and to Daniela for participating in the Slack this week. And I know a couple of other of you are involved in things as well. I don't want to miss out. Min is involved in the ethics work, and Krishna and Shruti have been involved in that as well. If you have any questions, please let me know. And I hope Anson can join us soon. He hasn't been feeling well in the last couple months, and I hope he can join us this summer and work on some stuff. So thank you. Have a good week.